Welcome back to the Visited by Voices Live. I'm joined today by a writer in a couple different mediums that has really helped inside the graphic novel / comic book industry to bring a certain level of darkness and literacy that is well needed, not just to the forum, but to our culture in general. He's worked with a lot of established properties that you know, things like Deadpool and X-Men and Venom. But he's also worked inside of things he has created himself, properties that he has developed from scratch, which is always the most important work we can do, to turn nothing into something, with all, apologies to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Cullen, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, this was actually kind of an amazing thing for me. I wish I could tell you a sexier version how I came to your work, but instead there was this pandemic, and I refused to not see new movies, whether it was a drive-in, a small independent house with very restricted, amount of seating allowed. So there's this movie that came out called The Empty Man, and I kind of ignored it because the marketing was terrible. But then in about the third week of being out, I said, okay, well, I see everything that's in the genre, so I'm going to go through this. And I absolutely loved the film and couldn't understand any of the reviews I've read of it, because everyone was saying it was just kind of like a Bye-Bye Man / Candyman ripoff type thing. And that was not what I saw. So I decided I needed to search down the source material. And that was the next pleasant surprise, because while that film was in its own right, I think, a great thing, the source material is this entire world that both complements and contrasts in some interesting ways. So you got me from here on out. I might not have started back at the beginning with you, but I'm not going to leave you now.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you.
So what's it like being the kind of go-to guy if they want to bring horror elements into traditional comic books?
Well, I don't know if I'm the go-to guy. I mean, it's it's interesting because you mentioned working for Marvel and DC, and those guys never once considered me for horror projects. They would launch horror based projects, and they never bothered to even bring my name up. And that's nothing against the people that wrote them. They have some very talented writers that are doing some interesting things in the horror genre. But for so long, I feel like in comics, especially established characters, horror characters are treated almost like a joke. They're and often the butt of the joke, and that's not that doesn't do anyone any favors, really. So and that was probably even before I really got into working in comics. So I don't know if I'm the go-to guy. I appreciate that so many readers see me as the horror guy in comics. On the indie side of things, I think editors see that's what I like to do, and it's where my passions lie. I don't know that it's ever helped me necessarily with any of the non-indie stuff.
Well, we'll get to that because I want to talk Boom Comics with you a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
But for right now, I want to start where I start with everyone. Obviously, you're a genre guy. I don't think you could do the work you do. It would show. It would show if you didn't love this stuff.
Right.
How did you originally get bitten by the horror bug?
It's weird. People ask that question, and my answers always change, because I used to say, "Oh, I didn't like horror when I was a kid," but that's not true, because I was, from a very young age, I was reading horror comics like DC's House of Mystery, mainly the anthology books, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Ghosts, and then all the great Charlton comics anthologies. Mm-hmm. I was reading those when I was very young. I mean, they weren't my introduction to comics, but they were right along. They entered my my orbit around the same time as any comic would have entered my orbit. So I was reading that stuff. I was always fascinated by horror movies. The first two movies I ever went to see were Jaws and Food of the Gods. That my dad took me to see.
That's pretty awesome.
And so I was always into it to some degree. Maybe as I got a little older, I got more interested in fantasy and science fiction. And then somewhere along the line, somewhere in high school, I decided I wanted to be a special effects makeup artist. I don't even know how that, dawned on me. That's what I wanted to do. But then I started reading a lot more, like Fangoria, Gore Zone, those great magazines. And they were, there were reviews of great novels and books in those magazines, and that turned me on to that. And then, at some point, the desire to be a special effects makeup artist went to the wayside, and I decided I wanted to tell stories. And when I was really, really getting into submitting stories and trying to get published, it was always horror stuff that was that's what I kept going back to again and again.
So let me ask. I think that for a lot of horror comic aficionados, and by the way, House of Secrets is still a great read. You pick up those particular comics; they're amazing and so well written, which never gets talked about. Everyone ignores how well those books were written. They'll talk about EC.
And those EC books are amazing, but right. I think those DC anthologies, and I can't stress enough those Charlton anthologies. They could go toe to toe with them to some degree. There were some really great things coming out in those books.
On the Marvel side, they have one title that I've always thought was superlative. It was not an anthology, but unfortunately, they treat like crap. Not elements from it, and that's Tomb of Dracula.
Yeah, that series. It was such a cool concept for a series, and it ran 70-something issues. I mean, it was awesome. And they haven't figured out since that time. They have not figured out how to make that happen again. It's rare. I mean, I think maybe Immortal Hulk is leaning into that now. It's more of a horror series, but the fact that they were able to do, you know, a 70-something issue series about Dracula as a villain, and it was genuinely had some really, you know, scary moments in it. That was lightning in a bottle for them, and they just haven't been able to duplicate it.
Yeah, because I mean, even the sister titles like Werewolf at Night, it's a shadow of it. I like it, but
well, I love all that stuff from that era of the you know, Man Thing and Werewolf by Night, and you know, all those horror heroes. I've always been a huge fan of. But yes, Tomb of Dracula was the, you know, the granddaddy of that, really.
So you end up writing for books like Deadpool and X-Men and Venom. So your work always has kind of a tinge of darkness in it. It feels like no matter what. Is it just who you are?
Yeah, it's who I am. It's what comes across naturally to some degree. Look, I love, you know, superhero stories. I love science. You know, I love all those different kinds of stories. But yeah, I'm gonna, if given my druthers, I'm gonna sort of gravitate back to, you know, some form of horror story. When I was first approached to write, I did a series for Marvel called Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe, and when they approached me to write it, I said, well, what I want to do is let's play Deadpool like Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger in the Marvel Universe. It's a horror story. I mean, yes, it's Deadpool, so it has to be humor, but let's make it dark. And I did that a lot with Deadpool. You know, my Magneto series with Marvel was essentially a horror series if you really look at it. And I drew a lot, you know, of inspiration from like Tomb of Dracula and things like that, because it was a series about a villainous character doing, you know, his thing. So yeah, I gravitate back to that a lot of times, you know, regardless of what I'm working on, but you know, not always, but it definitely surfaces again and again.
Yeah, it seems like the you end up there with even the character choices, something like Star Wars Darth Maul or Moon Knight, or of course Pumpkinhead. That's probably the most obvious one. You end up where your strengths are.
Yeah, it's you know, and I think that's just you know, that's true of most writers, and maybe it speaks to a limitation on my part, but you know, it's just where I feel most comfortable. It's, you know, I want to write the kind of stories that I would enjoy, so that's, you know, that leads me down that path.
Another thing I think is really kind of your it feels like your trademark from a reader standpoint. And as a writer, I can see kind of like the edges of where you're choosing to work. It's important to you to write relatable, very human characters.
Yeah, I try. You know, I think it's you know, this is where I think, especially in comics, in horror novels, they've figured this out long ago. But you know, in comics, it's important to make these characters, to try to make the characters relatable, to try to catch the reader on an emotional level, so that they care about them, because that's where, you know, you can have all the gore dripping tentacles in the world, but if you don't care about those characters, it's not going to scare anybody.
Absolutely. Dan has a question in the chat. I'm going to just weave these questions in here, even if they're a little bit of diversion, simply so I don't lose them, because I'm not that good. That would not be Dan. The chat's moving faster than I am. Can you tell us a little bit about your Godzilla graphic novel work? Also, what do you think of the new film?
Yeah, so Godzilla has been, you know, I was talking about watching Jaws and Food of the Gods. At that same time, I was watching Godzilla every weekend. Every weekend, it was on in the afternoons, and I loved it. And Godzilla is still extremely important to me. In that there's a Godzilla poster right here on the wall, and there's, you know, another one back behind me on the wall that's washed out in the light, and there are Godzilla figures all over the place. I love Godzilla, so I approached IDW back in the day about doing a Godzilla book, just because they had the license. I knew I wanted to do it, and I was lucky enough that they actually had an opening on the schedule, and they said, yeah, let's go. and I was able to do just such a fun story because I kind of wanted to, I was thinking of movies like Destroy All Monsters, where these monsters are just ravaging everything. And I wanted to think about what the world might look like after that event. And that's really where the story for Godzilla Cataclysm came from. And it was a blast. Toho was a dream to work with. You never know what you're going to get when you deal with a licensor, but they were awesome to work with. They didn't really, dial me back on anything. And the only thing that even got changed, there were a couple of monsters that I had to swap out only because they were in use somewhere else in the comics. It was never Toho telling me, don't use that creature. I wanted to do more, but unfortunately, did not get the chance to before licenses started changing and scheduling started changing. So, I'd love to do more Godzilla books, but who knows? And as far as the new movie, I enjoyed it. It was. I'm not going to spoil anything for anybody. It was, it ended. It was pretty much what I expected. In that, I sat down with my son to watch it. And I said, this is what's going to happen. And that's what happened, all the way from, every beat. And it was just what I was expecting. So I was pretty pleased with it. I like the new MonsterVerse movies. And I like that I can watch them with my kid and he enjoys them. It's hard for me, from a nostalgia standpoint, it's hard for the new movies to stand up to, the old stuff. Both the stuff I was watching as a kid, and then when I got back into Godzilla in the 90s, it's tough to compare to those for me. Just there was something special about watching them all.
Well, I definitely agree. I think of the MonsterVerse incarnation, I do think that Godzilla King of the Monsters, the second film, stands up to anything in the franchise except the first film. The 54 is kind of the gold standard, and simply because that movie still does exactly what it set out to do. It's still a perfect paranoia film. But I do really enjoy them.
I like them all. I can't. Even the ones I don't like, I still like a little bit. So
listen, I'm a King Caesar fan here.
Who's not? Yeah, who's not? Look, that was King Caesar. He may be my well, I can't say he's my second. He's probably my third or fourth favorite monster. I love that guy. And it's all because of Mechagodzilla. When I was a kid in the afternoons, he was so cool, so it's hard to compete with that. He wasn't as cool in Final Wars. I wasn't as excited for him when I was excited when he showed up in Final Wars, and then I was disappointed, sad.
So I want to get back to your work, but I want to talk Godzilla with you too. But I'll just say this: Final Wars is a film that I want to love, but it's so rushed. I didn't get to seep in that. I didn't get to seep in that world at all. And then we were having Matrix fights in tunnels on moving vehicles. I'm like, no, that we let this be a 12-minute sequence.
I was okay with it all. I gotta tell you, it's not a great movie. It is not. There's a big difference in great movies and movies that I love.
Its big claim to fame is it redeemed Minola.
Oh yeah.
You like the character, and that's all that really matters.
Yeah, and I can't remember his name, the MMA fighter who played the Colonel in the movie. He looked like an anime character with a big mustache, and he was awesome. He was so cartoonish for a live action person.
It was like the Japanese idea of an American, but he was,
and he was great. Yeah.
That's great. So our friend Piz has a controversial question. So
great, that's just what I need tonight. Thanks.
Because we both need to not have careers by the time this is over.
Watch me say I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Marvel and DC seem determined to launch titles with an emphasis on identity politics. What are your thoughts of the direction of contemporary comics?
So it's interesting, and it's a tough question. I don't know. I do not believe that these publishers are out and out trying to say let's create an identity politic comic. That's not the goal, but they are trying to appeal to a different audience in some cases. And yeah, I think I think sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I don't think I don't think that the immediate knee jerk, this is an identity politics game, is always accurate. You also have to think they're bringing in different creators. I think it's important to have a varied group bullpen of creators out there. And these creators are, just like I said earlier, I'm going to write the stories and the characters that I think I would like. They're going to do the same thing. So I think it's a little knee jerk to always say it's playing the identity politics game, and that, but we are, they're bringing in other creators, other voices. I don't want the people who've been reading comics forever to feel left out, but I also don't want to leave out the people who haven't started reading comics yet.
Well, I don't think you'll have the problem, because my view on this is just comes down to good writing versus bad writing. If you're writing to make a point and you're not caring about characters or anything like that, of course it's not going to work, because it wouldn't work if it was a completely different point of view too.
Right.
But I think you can express anything beautifully, brilliantly, and I think there's an audience for.
It's tough right now. I remember someone asking me years ago in a panel at a convention. They said, how can you write about this subject? And I don't remember what the subject was. And I was like, well, or how can you write this character and they feel this? And I was like, well, they're characters, and it's not my job. It's not my job to say this person is vile or evil because of their opinion. Now, I might feel that way personally, but it's not my job to, if that's what the character feels, that's what the character feels. And again, I just want to write stories that feel right, feel realistic, and stories that I enjoy. But I also enjoy a lot of these stories that are coming out right now, and I like that there are different viewpoints coming out. I like that there are different kinds of stories being told. Oh,
I agree. I think I'm a big fan of the diversity. I'm not a fan of the idea of it's a goal into itself. I think we all have great stories to tell, from no matter where in the world you come from, and the more exotic your background, the more compelling it's likely to be for me. But again, it comes down to the quality of the work.
Yeah,
for me.
I don't, I feel like the writers and the stories that are coming out, I don't think anybody's forcing through bad writing. These are stories that people are proud of, and they're not all going to be winners, unfortunately. That's the nature of the business, is that the stories aren't going to all be winners, and a story that I think that fires on all cylinders for me may completely miss the mark with 90% of the other readers. And again, that's different writers, different approaches, different viewpoints, and different things they want to tell stories about.
Sure. And it's commercial art, so there's also a schedule involved, so that's always going to play a role.
There is absolutely a schedule involved.
Okay, so I'm going to let Sam's question come through now, to go completely to the other side of the world. On the topic of vampires, thoughts on Twilight? I mean, your name and all.
Yeah, well, that's about as much as I know about it. I mean, I think I did not read the books. I think I probably watched the first or second movie. I mean, I don't know much more about Twilight. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it was the cultural phenomenon of it all was pretty interesting to me. And I don't care that vampires sparkled or were good looking or charming or whatever. It doesn't bother me. It's fine. They're not my type of vampires. My type of vampires would be near dark. That is there's my vampires.
We don't just look alike. We also share exactly the same opinion on vampire movies.
Right. That's what I would want. In my vampires, it's near dark is like the epitome of vampires. Twilight is the antithesis of near dark. And I would like to see a crossover movie, but that's about all I know about Twilight.
I get crap all the time for saying that Near Dark is a far superior film than Lost Boys. But
Near Dark is absolutely a better movie. And look, I love Lost Boys. Near Dark's a much better movie. I think so. Much better movie. I don't even think they're in the same ballpark. And I love Lost Boys. I really do, but it doesn't compare.
So that's actually an interesting transition because you do some weird Western work.
Yes.
And I think Near Dark fits into that category.
It does, yeah. So
with something like The Sixth Gun, is that a hard sell for comics?
It can be. I mean, look, there was an era in comics where weird Westerns and Westerns in general were all the rage. I mean, that was what comics were about for, a good chunk of time. But, nowadays, and I say nowadays, The Sixth Gun's been out for, over a decade now. But it wasn't a tough sell to the publisher. Well, I take it back. It was a tough sell to the publisher. They turned it down. And then someone in Hollywood said, "Hey, we sure would like a weird Western." And they came running back and said, "Oh, hey, guess what?" Because I'd already developed this weird Western. So, from that point of view, it was, it wasn't a tough sell. Once, the book lasted 50 issues. And that's tough in in comics in general. No matter what the comic is, 50 issues is a very successful run. And we were able to tell exactly the story we wanted to tell. And, so that means it had a following. And I still think it's exciting for me because the book still gets new readers. There's still people who haven't read it yet that pick it up and can enjoy it. I think it's actually, comparatively speaking, I think it's a very good crossover comic, because I think if people love superheroes, which are maybe the majority of comic book readers, that this is an easy intro to indie comics for them. It has a lot of pop sensibilities, and and it's bright and colorful, and there are cowboys with superpowers and or magic guns with superpowers. And I think it's an easy, if you've only read one kind of comic, it's a great intro to other comics or other types of books.
And on the other end, it seems like Harrow County is kind of going back to your love of those anthology comics in a lot of ways, being able to show shorter arcs but again, that humanity you're bringing to the characters always comes through.
Yeah, Harrow County, and Sixth Gun and Harrow County, both of them are very near and dear to me. And if someone were to say, name a book for a new reader, someone who's never read my work, what would I recommend to them? It's either going to be Sixth Gun or Harrow County. And it's hard for me to pick one or the other. And Harrow County it's got a little more of that, House of Mystery vibe. It's really digs into the sort of ghost stories and rural legends that circulated when I was a kid and were key in getting me interested in horror in general. So it's a lot of fun to revisit that. And just like Sixth Gun, it ran, it was a good long run, and we were able to tell exactly the story we wanted to tell without it getting the rug pulled out from under us.
And that's a challenge. A lot of companies, if there's a dip in sales, demand changes.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's, like I said, the days of really long runs of comics are kind of, over. There are a few indie books that definitely, buck that trend, but it's tough to really have one of those massive runs on comics, and to be able to do it, especially in, with a couple of, a book about, ghosts in the country and magical guns in the Old West. It's it's rewarding for me that people stuck with us long enough to read those books for that long.
Definitely. So I need to ask now, Boom Comics.
Yes.
How in the world did you say, I want to do that? I mean, obviously this is the second story. So already there was a sales push. So I understand how that happened. But the bigger question is just, I can't even imagine pitching Empty Man, let alone getting it to fruition.
Yeah, it was a weird pitch because, it's such a surreal sort of comic. It doesn't necessarily fit into the box of comics, right? It doesn't look the way a lot of comics look, and the story doesn't play out the way a lot of comic stories play out. And I'm thinking back on the pitch process though, and it actually went through really smooth. I mean, I wrote a 1.5 page pitch for the comic series and sent it in. They came back and said, "Can you tell us a little bit more about the characters that are involved and where the first arc would go?" I wrote that up. It was another couple of pages, and it was, we were off to the races. They didn't even flinch at that story. So
Boom really, I mean, Boom must actually be really, willing to just go for it. My other favorite current, right, is also from them.
Sure.
And yeah, there's a lot of similarities between the two books actually, but there's such different perspectives and the storytelling approaches are so different.
Yeah, I feel like they're very open to look. I think there are a lot of great publishers out there that are very open to different kinds of stories. And Boom, Boom kind of reflects that in terms of the indie sensibility. They're open to doing a book like The Empty Man. My next book with Boom was a book called The Unsound, which was also a complete mess. Not mess, but it was just a bizarre concept that didn't necessarily feel like what someone might pitch for a comic book. So, that's one of the things I love about them is that they don't, there have been things I've pitched to them that they're like, we're not so sure about this one, but they don't flinch at the weird ideas.
So there's definitely a cosmic horror element to Empty Man, but it's not it. But in the storytelling practice, it couldn't be more different from Lovecraft, right? Which is fascinating. And then I sit there and say, well, this guy obviously grew up reading some Clive Barker too. Because you can see that influence. I see a little bit of Ramsey Campbell. I see a lot of writers. Am I wrong, or were you trying to do something cosmic? Because you definitely did. But was that always an intention that someday you wanted to do your cosmic lore?
Oh yeah, I love that sort of world building and myth building. I've always wanted to do cosmic horror, but I have very, very little interest in writing a story about Cthulhu or any of the Lovecraftian pantheon.
Right.
I'm not saying I don't like those stories. I do, but it's more about the weirdness of it all that really appeals to me. And and I have my own pantheon of mythos that's out there that I keep in a little book, that there are little connections between my stories that are some may be obvious and some are not, but the Empty Man exists within that mythology. It's part of that. I was more interested in doing a story involving something, an unseen spiritual force, really, that has, global implications, than I was with, a story about, a giant octopus creature coming out of the sea. Again, I love those kind of stories. It's just not what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, I think a lot of my stuff comes back to cosmic horror, on a big scale like Empty Man, or on a smaller scale, but I'm always interested in that kind of stuff.
One thing I found fascinating in my read through was how the Empty Man himself has very little, well, himself, even that even probably is problematic, but
right.
The Empty Man as a concept, it's not just that some people, like mass media refers to it as a virus, but it's affecting people like some kind of paranormal power, and it's so individual for everyone. It's definitely like the primordial soup of psychology, just raised for every character, to the point where the characters almost contradict each other in what it is. And you reflect that too brilliantly in the fact that you use multiple timelines in every issue.
Yeah, it's it's important to me that there's never sort of a firm definition of what the Empty Man is, and it does change, because the way I pitched the series was very simply, there's a contagious insanity sweeping across the world, and people are worshiping it like a god. And so I really wanted to look at how the faithful would look at things differently, and how they would interpret their faith and these events differently, and how no one can communicate it to each other. It doesn't work that way. I have long, I've long worried that we will, as a society, get to a point where our communications and understanding will break down to the point that we can't communicate. You and I can't even talk on the, through this, through StreamYard, because we just can't. It'll break down. And that's really, the Empty Man was, and I kind of do a lot of that in a lot of my different books, but the Empty Man is probably the most, that's most on the nose, is that it's about, this breakdown of society, or, it's a breakdown of communication, and how that reflects a breakdown in society.
Another thing I thought was fascinating is that, especially the first series, is very much mood and atmosphere all the way through. It is dark and it's deep, and Vanessa R. Del Rey's artwork reflects that. It's a little foggy and blurry intentionally.
Oh, yeah.
And it's written to be dark and mysterious. And then Recurrence is brighter.
Yeah.
But the thing about Recurrence is amazing is that the writing matches that decision. And that series actually ends with a prolonged action sequence, which you wouldn't expect from a book that's been mostly mood and atmosphere up to that point.
Yeah, it's true, and it was interesting. It's interesting you bring it up now, because I was just working on a script earlier today, and I've been writing down these sort of, my rules of comics, and one of the things I wrote down as I was working on the script today is that every issue needs to be different than the last. It can't be the same story over and over and over again. And that translates to, in a big way, to every series needs to be different. I didn't want the second Empty Man series to feel like the first Empty Man series. I wanted them to be in the same world, but very different. And also, that second series came out, a few years after the first one. And I knew that people would be reading it and never have read the first series. And I wanted it to feel like its own, its own semi-complete thing that they could get in and enjoy, even if they hadn't read that initial book.
Yeah, besides a few character things, I don't think there's anything that would catch anyone offbeat.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, I kind of got to the point where I was like, you know what? I gotta, I'm not writing a story set in this world and not introduce some of the characters that were in the previous story. So at some point, I decided, no, I'm going to go ahead and bring them in. But I tried to make it at least interesting enough that that new readers could get in and read it and enjoy it without that. And then maybe go back and read The Empty Man and get a completely different, the first series, and then get a completely different experience out of it.
Well, definitely. So we're getting now to the adaptation of Empty Man. Again, I came at it as that was my introduction to the mythos and to you. But looking back now, I have a weird perspective. Watching the movie after having read all the three series, one thing I think is amazing is how much they smuggled in without telling the same story.
Oh, yeah.
With the skeletonized version of one of the manifestations, it's not the same, but it feels the same. It feels like the film equivalent.
Yeah, it's interesting, because when I first read that script, I was talking to the producers about it, and I said, this feels like it's not the same story, but it feels like something that could take place in the world. It's taking place, the Empty Man's in this city, and this is the story that's taking place across the country in this other city. And I liked that, because I don't think that the Empty Man the movie would have the movie would have served anybody well if it was just like a shot by shot remake of the comic. I'm glad that it was interesting. I'm glad that people can watch the movie and experience a certain kind of story, and then they can read the comic and experience a very different story. But yeah, in my mind, they all take place in the same. They're all happening in the same world, and we even did when the movie was released on streaming. Disney asked me to do like a 6-page online comic
Crossing the Bridge.
Yeah, and I even incorporated some of the comic material into that story just to make them, to kind of give them some connective tissue, or not. Who knows with the Empty Man? It's so bizarre,
right? Because it's different. People see it differently.
That's right.
None of it's reliable,
yeah.
But I did think it was fascinating when they do cross over in moments, like the story of the woman feeding her infants the dogs is both in the comic and in the film, told by different characters.
That's my favorite bit, by the way, in the movie.
Told by different characters, which means it's kind of like it's established as an urban legend in the entire Empty Man verse.
Yeah, and and the movie kind of goes out of its way, this idea that urban legends are another method of spreading sort of the Empty Man curse or the Empty Man reality.
It's kind of like media.
Yeah.
Of its own sort, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
because you have that line about we were all receivers and we were all senders, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah. And
I get it.
The movie, the previews made it look like that's all the movie was about urban legends. You cross a bridge, and the preview and the movie are so very different. I think it's I can see why people would go in. They see the preview and like, I really want to watch that movie about this urban legend, and then they get in and like, what the hell just happened to me?
Yeah, you're 20 minutes in, you're going, this is not the movie I bought the ticket for, but I'm liking it.
Right.
I also thought the fact that a single frame, which again you use to world build, you use all these single, whether it's the interviews at the beginning, whereas you're getting all these clips of interviews, or just these single frames that tell you of things that happened here or there or there. It widens that scope of the story without slowing the story down. But there's a shot in a comic of a bunch of people hanging from a bridge, and that's a major plot point in the movie. Is it the same incident? It doesn't even matter, but it feels like it is.
Yeah, those are definitely that's an image that was pulled from the comic, but yeah, it doesn't it doesn't matter. It's the same incident, and I'm okay with it not with us not knowing.
Oh yeah, no, I love that haziness of mythology being used. I actually feel like the film is a modern classic, and I think your comics are a modern classic in their respective forms. That doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I really do think the movie is starting to look. It came out at the worst possible time for a movie to come out. It unfortunately came out the timing was terrible. But I think it's kind of it's interesting. The last several weeks, especially, I'm seeing a lot more feedback on the movie, a lot more people finding it. It's becoming sort of a cult classic to some degree, and then hopefully that turns people onto the comic, because I do think it you get a very different story. It just builds on it and is it's additional story that you can read and enjoy.
I think it's happening. But I will tell you the one from a commercial standpoint, it was a horrible time to release the film. But from a artistic standard, you couldn't have asked for a better time to release a movie about a pandemic than during a pandemic when people aren't actually communicating properly. Look, everyone's believing in conspiracy theories. It's kind of perfect.
I know, and I guess to some degree the book's a little prophetic in that that perspective, right? I wrote that in 2014. And here, the last year has been the Empty Man has come out in in droves.
We are all the Empty Mans these days.
That's right.
And
at least y'all feel it.
I'm going to leave the Empty Man movie in just a second, but I do want to say that if you guys want to leave a comment under this video explaining what you think the Empty Man would force you to do. So start it with the Empty Man made me do it, and then tell your story. I am giving away one copy of the film, Redbox.
Nice.
The only way to own a physical copy, I am going to give away a copy to whoever comes up with the most creative answer. Sam cannot participate because she's picking the winner.
I didn't even know that movie was on Redbox.
That's the only way you can get a physical copy.
I had no idea.
Redbox are currently selling their copies. There are multiples. That's the only way you can get it. It's a digital exclusive from Disney that they will not. Yeah. There is an Australian disc that came out, but
there you go.
It's the same disc though. It's just an Australian package, and you have to pay $30 to get it imported.
Right.
So my choice was simple.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, guys, just get creative. Started off with The Empty Man Made Me Do It, and if your choice is if Sam chooses you, go for it. And by the way,
I'm going into the comments.
Absolutely. Do you not have a copy of the movie?
I have. I only digital. I have so many copies of the movie digitally because I saw so many different versions. I mean, there are so many cuts of that movie that are in existence,
and I want them all.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this: Christopher Young's score.
Oh yes.
I mean, you're a horror fan. You're a Clive Barker fan, so there's the connection there. Could you have, if you could handpick a composer, you probably would have come up with Christopher Young, wouldn't you?
He would have been my first choice. Actually, it's great because the producers called me and see, I just said I've seen all these different versions of the movie. Every version I saw until the movie came out was without the score. It was all without a soundtrack, and the producers called me and said, "Hey, Cullen, so we got someone doing the score for us. Don't know if you're familiar with Christopher Young." And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And they're like, "Oh, so you've heard of him?" I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Yes, I could name all these movies he's done that are just the scores are amazing. I probably wrote vast sections of The Empty Man while listening to some of the scores he composed. So that was actually a big geek moment. And then then I was able, they put me in touch with him, so I was able to talk to him and tell him how much his music means to me. And it was super exciting for me.
Yeah, and I think it helps to give the film exactly the feel it needs.
Oh yeah, it's so good with the scores. The score's amazing, and yeah, it absolutely it serves the movie well for sure.
And here's my last thing I'm going to say about the movie: best use of the phrase "oh fuck no" in film history.
It's probably it's awesome because it's such a tense scene, and then you're like. But you laugh out loud because, that's exactly what you would say.
We all were. Yeah. But so we can't not talk about your prose fiction, both Crooked Hills and Creeping Stones and other stories. Writing horror fiction is certainly dear to my heart, but you do. I mean, Crooked Hills is like a middle-age.
Yeah,
that's a popular but tough thing.
Yeah, it is, and it obviously I went with a very small publisher for Crooked Hills. We did the dance with a lot of publishers on that book, and then went with a very small publisher, and now it's out of print for the most part.
I feel your pain.
And it's weird because there's another novel out there for me. It's mostly written. And I'm like, what do I do? How do I get this book? How do I put this book out? And I've considered a lot of, Crooked Hills. I've considered having someone go through and read it for all the and do sort of a stand-like update. Take all the things that no longer make sense to to a younger reader now, and they read. I don't know what I mentioned. Maybe I mentioned a Game Boy or something like, what's a Game Boy?
What is this prehistoric technology you speak of?
Right. So I thought about updating the first book and then releasing the second one in some format. For me, it's important that it's a physical edition, not just a digital. I think kids are still reading physical editions. So I think about it a lot. I love writing for that age group. I have a graphic novel coming out in July from HarperCollins. That's another middle reader's horror story. So I love working for that age group. And yeah, I that book's near and dear to me. I just I have yet to figure out what to do on the second book.
Well, I can tell you that the publishing game doesn't get a whole lot easier.
No.
So just hang tight and you know, get used to writing query letters.
Right.
At least there's no more self-addressed stamped envelopes involved. That's what I always, when I get depressed about it, I keep going back to that. In the early days, that sucked.
Yes, well, it did. I you know, I can't say I miss those at all.
No. So where do you see both yourself going in the genre, and where do you see the genre going in the next few years?
Well, hey, let's ask an easy question. You know, for me, it's you know, I'm gonna keep doing as many, you know, creator-owned titles as I can. I feel like I'm going to be pushing the boundaries of what a horror story can be, and what, you know, the types of horror stories that are out there. I want to play in as many of the subgenres of horror as I can, and that's, you know, that's my focus. You know, I aside from, I'm doing a little bit of work for Valiant Comics, and that's, you know, horror as well. Shadow Man from Valiant is a horror superhero comic. But aside from that, I'm taking very few, you know, work for hire comics anymore. I'm only taking projects that I feel like I can bring something to the character, or I can do something very unique with the story, and it has to fit my brand, whatever that you know, amorphous weirdo brand is. But you know, with my creator-owned stuff, I know, you know, I can control that. So I've got a lot of new creator-owned stuff over the next several years, and that's where I want to spend my time. Both, you know, middle reader on up to whatever, you know, whatever I am, old reader, I guess. I don't know.
when did we become the old guys, huh?
Yeah, well, it happened, I think, about 20 years ago for me.
That's
Yeah, and then as far as where horror is going, you know, it's always been peaks and valleys, right?
Absolutely.
And you know, we're in sort of this, and it's peaks and valleys in different mediums. You know, we're in sort of a, I feel like we're in an interesting place, especially when we're talking about, you know, the elevated genre. That's the catchphrase we hear all the time now, elevated genre, and I love that stuff. But you know, we also get some, you know, we need some boots on the ground horror too, you know. And I you know, I think you know, I think we'll see both of those things continuing on, which is awesome. And maybe, you know, my hope is a lot of the other media in horror translates into people reading more horror stuff. You know, I have a big dream that horror comics start getting a little bit of their due in as far as writing goes, because it's been years that they don't get their due. I mean, and it's a little frustrating to me to some degree, because and I'm not talking about just my books. There's just a lot of great horror comics out there. And I remember years where people would say, oh, well, they're just, you know, the awards programs would say, you know, oh, there just weren't any good horror comics out this year, so we don't even have that category. To which I say a mighty, mighty bullshit.
Yeah.
But you know, because there were dozens and dozens and dozens of great horror comics that year. And I don't, you know, I think people need to start recognizing, you know, I want people to recognize that there are some comics out there that are just as frightening as any story you'll read, any, you know, prose story you'll read. So I'm hoping that, you know, I'm going to make it my personal goal to make that, you know, to bring that revelation to people.
Crusade, man. Go Crusade.
That's right.
I'm going to give the last question from the chat of the evening to Dan, since he's been with us and commenting all night. He asks, can you tell us a little bit about your work on Pumpkinhead?
Yeah. So Pumpkinhead, was obviously a movie I loved. I saw it opening night in the theater when it came out, and I've loved it ever since. It struck, the right chord for me in terms of that, backwoods horror that I love so much. So I was actually at San Diego Comic-Con, and I was walking in the middle of the massive crowd, crossing the street from one of the hotels to the convention center, and I was looking at my phone, and I saw a little news blurb come up that said, Dynamite Comics acquires the Pumpkinhead comic. And I was like, what? And I immediately on my phone wrote an email with my thumb to the editor I knew at Dynamite, to one of the editors I knew at Dynamite, and said, I don't know if you have found a writer yet, but you just did. And I expressed in no uncertain terms that I'd be angry if I didn't get to write a Pumpkinhead comic. So, and luckily they had not found a writer yet. So they called me back or emailed me back, and we started the ball rolling. And there's just this great line in the movie. One of the things I wanted to do is make a sequel to the first movie and ignore all the other movies that had come out.
Oh, there's more than one?
Exactly. And so I wanted to, there was this great line in the movie where Haggis says that for each of man's sins, there's a special demon exists. And I was like, well, there's my story right there. There's lots of demons because man's full of sin. And I just wanted to explore this idea of multiple demons representing all the different sins of man. And there we go. That's where that comic came from and what it resulted in.
Awesome. Well, Cullen, I want to really thank you for coming on today. You're one of those guys that went from 0 to 60 in my book. I went from not knowing any of your work to being a hardcore fan real fast.
Well, I appreciate that.
And I got to tell you, there's more need than ever for fresh, original takes in the genre. Even though there's more being produced, it's easy to fall into trends and tropes. And you've done your part to avoid that. And the more popular what your fingerprints become, the more hope I have for the future. So thank you for coming on. And I just want to let you know that we're all going to stay tuned with all those links I put in the description to every way on earth to stay in touch with what you're doing, which I stole off your Twitter today, by the way.
That's fine. Hey, that's what it's there for, man. That's, steal away.
Well, there's a tradition of that in horror, I suppose. I want to just say to everyone out there, the show will be back on Friday with Gwendolyn Christ. And then we will have some shows from next week to announce where we're going to rope Sam into actually appearing on camera. I do want to also say that our friend of the show, Darren Burrows, has a show on YouTube called Talkin' Stock that relaunched, and you should all go check out his show. It's very, very good. And also, our friend Hayden over at the Cornelius Collective tonight is doing a Empty Man watch along. Got to provide your own copy, laws. But if you want to go check out the film with him, he'll be spending his 2 hours and 15 minutes talking about what they're seeing on screen. Any final words, Cullen?
No, just thank you for the support. If thank you for having me on tonight. It means a lot. And if people aren't familiar with my stuff, you showed them the links. There's plenty of opportunity to check some of it out. And then I'm very active on Twitter, so you can find me out there if you want to talk about any of it. That's where to do it.
Support with your wallets, guys. We get more of what sells. Have a great night.
Thanks.
I think we do.